I'm Brandon Crilly.
I'm Dan Collins, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's December 2nd, 2020. I'm John Swinimer. If you have a comment, criticism, or question, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Brandon Crilly and Dan Collins about Flip Volume 2. The podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. And don't forget to check out the new YouTube channel. Brandon is an Ottawa teacher by day and has been previously published by Daily Science Fiction, Abyss and Apex, Pulp Literature, On Spec, Flame Tree Publishing, and other markets. His short comic True Balance was published by Marcosia Press in 2020 with art by Scott Drummond. With Evan May, he's a co-host of the Aurora Award-nominated podcast Broadcast from the Wasteland, described as eavesdropping on a bunch of writers at the hotel bar. He reviews fiction for Blackgate.com and serves as programming lead for CanCon in Ottawa, and regularly has too many D&D campaign ideas that he could fit into his schedule. Dan is a writer for various publications, including The Adventures of Little Aurora Man and Friends, plus others. He's also a founding member and podcaster of Hey Kids Comics radio show. And his latest project is Flip Volume 2. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Brandon Crilly and Dan Collins about Flip Volume 2. So, Brandon Crilly, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
No worries.
Appreciate your time. What I normally do to start off the conversation is ask creators about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
I'll be honest, I'm not sure if I remember the first one that I ever read. I think it was probably something Star Wars related, probably Dark Empire or an adaptation of something Star Wars, because that was what I was mostly into when I was a kid. I know I fell out of reading comics for quite a bit of time, and so when I got back into it recently, the first comic that got me back in was Black Science by Rick Remender.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Which is just a fabulous series. And then that was, like, in terms of the world building and the character work, it kind of, like, reinvigorated my interest in comics. And so I've been jumping into more, like, series and volumes more recently. But it was Remender that got me in.
Cool. Well, besides Rick Remender, do you have any other inspirations that help you out with creating your art today?
One of the biggest ones recently would be I get most of my inspiration from novel writers and prose. But so Rebecca Roanhorse is one that I've been reading quite a bit. Her book Trail of Lightning and Storm of Locusts, which is the sequel, that is just fabulous. Kind of like post-apocalyptic fantasy. Alex White's Salvagers trilogy, which is like adventure science fiction but with magic and like such a Firefly feel to it that it is just absolutely phenomenal. Besides Remender, and in terms of comics, I read recently The Wicked and the Divine, which again is like just mind-blowing fiction, and the artwork in that is just absolutely fabulous. And then what did I just finish reading in terms of short fiction, which again is something else I read quite a bit? There was this anthology that I just picked up, Glitter Plus Ashes, from Neon Hemlock, which is short fiction specifically by queer authors with queer characters in like post-apocalyptic worlds. And what really struck me about that, and I think what I really look for in my fiction and what inspires me, is like there's this nugget of hope in every single story in that anthology. And even though the stuff that I write isn't necessarily always hopeful, I try to find writers and stories that are as hopeful as possible these days, at least.
Wow, very good. Good start. So, wanted to ask you how you got your start in comic books.
The comic for Flip Volume 2 is actually my very first one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was, I had seen, like, I've known Jack for a few years through CanCon, which is the writers' conference here in Ottawa that I help organize. And, a couple other comic artists that I've met through the con and hadn't really experimented much with comics. But then I read Flip Volume 1. A good friend of mine, Derek Kunskin, who has a comic in Volume 2. He was in, and I was reading his comic, and the other one's in there. I was like, the concept was brilliant with the flip words, and I was talking to Jack, and he said, if you ever have an idea, float it to me. And I was spitballing a bunch of ideas for short fiction, and then I was looking at the one that ended up becoming the focus for my comic, True Balance, and I was like, oh, that could I could totally do a script about that. And then I had to do a ton of like, reading up and studying and looking at script formats and talking to comic artists and then trying to figure out the form because it was very new to me. And then Jack managed to enjoy the comic, and then we found an artist for it. And so like every step in the process was very new and fascinating and so incredibly different than short fiction. But yeah, that was the start anyway. It was just like getting fascinated with the idea and having an idea that Jack liked for the anthology.
Cool. Now, you mentioned the title of your story is called True Balance. Without giving too much away, can you talk a little bit about what that story is all about?
Yeah, so the basic idea, like I'm a history teacher by day. And so one of the things I find fascinating is things from ancient history. And so I focused on this idea of kind of what the world would be like if we still practiced something or followed something along the lines of Hammurabi's law code from ancient times. This idea of like an eye for an eye, and if somebody steals your cow, you get to steal his, or if somebody covets your spouse, you get to kill him, which is kind of ridiculous. And so like the idea behind Flip is you kind of take one aspect of the world and flip it on its head. And so I said, well, what if Canada's justice system was like Hammurabi's law code? And then being a teacher myself, like I said, I focused on this idea of like, if you have this world where the justice system is a little twisted, how would that affect kids? And so True Balance is, I kind of framed it as almost like a kid's morality tale, because kids, when they're trying to decide, between the difference between right and wrong and how they're going to make decisions, they kind of look to all the older people in their life for advice. And so the story in True Balance is this one particular kid who's been picked on all the time is told, okay, this other kid has been bullying you all the time. You get to decide how to get him back. You get to decide his punishment. And so this victim of bullying goes and he's trying to figure out how he wants to do that and look at what's an appropriate punishment. And he asks his older sister and he asks his parents, and you find out a little bit more about his life and his backstory before eventually he does decide what a balanced punishment would be. It's very much this like morality tale, sort of like, what would Billy do sort of story as it goes through. Yeah, and kind of following him and following his kind of learning journey in a way.
Oh, cool. That is very intriguing, that's for sure.
Oh, thank you.
So, given the topics presented in Flip and that you've read and elsewhere, do you see a need for people to use comic books as an escape from today's reality, especially everything that we're going through these days?
I think absolutely. Like I have enormous respect for any creator, whether it's comics or prose or film and television, if you can comment on what's going on in the world without directly commenting on it. Like the thing that comes to mind recently, and again, it's not a comic example, but is like the new Star Trek.
Right.
Like I don't want to spoil anything in case somebody hasn't seen it, but like the most recent Star Trek Discovery is really playing with ideas about like resource scarcity and the collapse of empire, even though the Federation isn't an empire, and those are very like real world concepts that people are grappling with right now. But the writers, they're able to do it in such a way, you don't feel like you're engaging with the real world, because it's Star Trek and the themes and connections to the real world are snuck in kind of subtly. And I think that's really, really important. But I think there's also this huge benefit to stories that are just fun and with fabulous characters and weird worlds and excitement and action. Like I think comics is really, really useful for that. Is you present these worlds that you can just totally get lost in. And like to mention Remender again, his more recent one, Seven to Eternity, I think is perfect for that, because the real focus I think in that series is on the characters themselves, on the journey that they're going through. And because you can get so connected to them and so lost in them, you can kind of forget problems that are around you. To me, that's the primary goal, I think, in fiction. It is like, let's distract each other from everything, really.
Right, exactly. That's what we need these days, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
Yeah. So you mentioned your work in Flip Volume 2. I'm wondering if there's anything else coming down the road that you can talk about. Like, what's next for you?
What is next? So I have kind of a couple of scattershot things. I've got actually an article about teaching, so it's not super related to comics, but in this magazine, which actually just came out in November, so this month. And I have a short story coming out in Pulp Literature, which is another Canadian science fiction, short fiction magazine. I think that's slated to come out in January. And then actually my podcast, we're Broadcasts from the Wasteland, which I record with Evan May, who's another author here in Ottawa, where I'm from. We're just starting to record our third season. Basically, we sit down with other creators and just very casually talk about the work we love and the work we're creating. So that'll drop probably sometime February, March.
Cool. Where can people find out about all your work? Do you have a social media presence?
I do. So I'm on Twitter at B_Crilly, Crilly. Or my website is brandoncrilly.wordpress.com. And it's got links to all of my stuff on there.
Cool. Well, Brandon, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering if there's something else I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview.
I would say, I'm going to go back to that, what you asked about kind of losing yourself in stories. The thing I think when it comes to creating stories that I think we need more and more is hope. Like hope punk was really like, I'm seeing it more and more in a lot of fiction the last few years, and I'm hoping that we don't lose that. And so I think if anybody's listening to this and they're a creator themselves, or they're struggling to write, I know I am this year struggling to create. I would encourage people to kind of focus on hope as much as they can. And, it's difficult, like all the time, but I think it's important, and I think we have a really powerful tool as creators to look for hope and find hope and maybe inspire it in other people.
Dan Collins, thank you very much for joining me again, chatting about Flip. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good. Yeah, in our last conversation, you mentioned briefly that you have a story in Flip Volume 2, and wanted to talk a little bit more about that. Can you explain what your story is?
Sure. So my story is called The Insurance Policy, and it's basically a story of corporate greed involving an insurance policy.
Now, typically, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm ignorant about this, but are you an insurance professional?
I am not an insurance professional, no.
So that begs my question. How did you do your research on this, or is research a big factor when it comes to writing this particular story?
This particular story is completely fantasy. There's no research involved.
Okay. Why did you pick this particular topic?
Well, it came about, I got into a small little fender bender a few years ago. And as I was going through the insurance process, I was thinking about, wouldn't it be great if your insurance actually guaranteed that you would never get into an accident instead of just, paying to fix your car later? And so this spawned out of that premise.
Oh, okay. Very good. You worked with a particular artist on this project. How did that come about?
I worked with Andrew Clark on this project, and Andrew and I had worked together previously on a Canadian Sentinel. He filled in doing some Canadian Sentinel pages when we were doing that for True Patriot Presents. And so when I had the opportunity to do this story, I brought him on board because I think he's a pretty fantastic artist.
Do you think you two will be working again on another project in the future?
I know he's pretty busy right now, and he's also got his own self-published comic called Adam that he does, but I would definitely love to work with him more. And we've talked about it, but nothing concrete yet.
Okay. Well, you never know. Well, I'm sure you'll give us a heads up if something were to come around.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit more philosophically. Given the topics presented in Flip, this particular volume, do you see a need for people to use comic books as an escape from today's reality, especially with what we're going through these days?
I think that comic books were, the medium was sort of born as escapism, and I think that it still has a very strong place in our world currently as a way to escape. And it's not just adults that need the escapism too. Like my kids love to read different comic books and stuff, so everybody needs an escape, and the comic book graphic novel medium is still a great place to do that.
And I guess the extra value of what you get out of Flip is talking to other collaborators, is that it's a morality tale more often than not in the what if situation. Do you think that's true for your story?
I do think that it is a morality tale. Yes, there's definitely I don't know if mine's a good morality tale, but it's a tale of, like I said, there's some corporate greed in here, and that is there's a moral to it, not necessarily a good one all the time though.
Okay. Now, the other day I was talking to Jack Briglio, the editor and sort of facilitator of this project, seeing if he would sneak out an idea about doing Volume 3. And I'm wondering if there were such a thing to happen, would you want to get involved, and would you have a story already in mind?
I don't necessarily have a story already in mind, but yes, I would definitely love to put something together for a future volume if possible. And the great thing about something like Flip is that because these are what if stories, it only takes that one split second idea where all of a sudden your brain's like, oh, well, yeah, what if this happened? So you can always come up with something cool, even if you don't have anything like already planned. I'm going to try to not get into any more accidents.
Okay, for sure. Well, Dan, those are all the questions I have for this particular interview, because I know we chat a lot about Whitcalf and your other projects, but I'm wondering if there's something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across this interview.
Well, in the last interview that when we talked, I had said that I didn't have anything that I could talk about as far as future projects. But then upon further reflection, I thought like, hey, just because I don't have this one thing, I can talk about some other stuff. So I'm working on Tractor Lad still, which was the very first thing you interviewed me about 3 years ago.
Oh, cool.
And so we have that was like a 10-page black and white issue that I had originally released, but we're myself and Sharon Gauthier, who I've worked with on Little Aurora Man, we're putting together a full color, full length first issue. And we still have some Canadian Sentinel stuff in the works. Myself and Justin Schaff are working on that for some future release somewhere down the line.
Thanks to Brandon and Dan for the chat. You can discover more about Brandon on Twitter at B_CRILLY and online at brandoncrilly.wordpress.com. You can discover more about Dan on Twitter at DanTheWritinMan and on Instagram at Instagram.com/Canuck_fan_Dan. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2020.